One of the big things, and certainly one of the reasons why I think the Conservatives did not want to put Boris Johnson back into the job was not only, of course, the November inquiry into his standards and how he acted, but also the Tories know full well that there is a full inquiry going on, or at least just gearing up to go into the pandemic to examine just what exactly went wrong and what happened? Like, how did we go as Jack Straw went from well, when Labour were in charge, with him coming forward saying that he was proud that the World Health Organization was coming out and saying, yes, Britain and France were one of the most prepared countries in the world for a potential pandemic. To, well, I think currently on the scoreboards, I think we are certainly the third, fourth most country in terms of death because of the pandemic. Just what went wrong? What happened? Ultimately, I think it will really come down to the fact of austerity. I think that ultimately damaged the NHS to a point where they had to cut things somewhere. And unfortunately, it does seem like the pandemic, shall we say, preparedness was certainly a casualty of it. But also, you have to look at the decision making process going on. And one of the interesting things that I've certainly picked up on throughout all of this was the fact that you had local councils and especially Public Health England, who were at the time ready and raring to go during the pandemic, had all the systems in place, were not being allowed to do their job by the central government. And I think that will certainly be one of the findings from this inquiry. But we are now having even more stuff pick up because the inquiry is now wanting to have a look at WhatsApp messages between ministers. And this, I think, is going to reveal some very interesting stuff. And even the Tories have said, knowing full well that this inquiry will certainly give them quite a beating. So I think this is yet another reason why the Tories did not want to put Boris Johnson back in charge. So before we go into this, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a rotation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all the people who do help and support the channel. So, off we go over to here with The Guardian with their story on this of the COVID-19 inquiry to examine Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages. The COVID-19 public inquiry plans to scour some of Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages as it seeks to identify any plainly wrongful decision-making and significant errors of judgment. I think they're going to find for plenty. I think there's plenty to find. But anyway, back to it. By the central government in the early stages of the pandemic. And the lead counsel into the inquiry has said that the opening of the second stage of the statutory inquiry is examining how central government responded to the pandemic and made key decisions that it did. Hugo Keith, KC, said that it would also ask whether the late lockdown cost lives and whether the rule breaking had undermined public confidence. Speaking in a parliamentary hearing before the witnesses are then cross-examined over the 8 weeks next summer, with the UK death toll from the confirmed COVID cases now exceeding over 180,000, Keith said that there would be a particular scrutiny of the decisions taken by the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, senior political advisors, and the scientific and medical advisors from early January of 2020 to the first national lockdown in late March. WhatsApp messages between Johnson, Downing Street, and other senior officials have also been requested alongside cabinet ministers and notes of written, oral, and advice to ministers. Lawyers for the disability campaigning groups calling for the department to actually admit to any deletion of the documents and explain how they were preserved WhatsApp, signal, or use of cabinet insufficient chat messages. Dominic Cummings, even Johnson's former chief advisor, has already published some messages from a Downing Street WhatsApp group used by him and Johnson, and ministers will be called to give evidence over the 8 weeks next summer. Keith said that the inquiry would also ask what the declared policy of following the scientific fair of reflection on the actual decision making. More than over 200 scientists, including those involved in the SAGE group and those other of the independent SAGE group, later which was highly critical of the government's handling of the pandemic, will have been asked to give evidence about the effectiveness of that response. The inquiry will ask how effectively SAGE was utilised by the central government, and Keith said he would also ask if there was an over-reliance on the epidemiological modelling or the mathematical modelling. Imperial College London, which employs Professor Neil Ferguson, the epidemiologist, whose predictions were prominent in the early pandemic, is among the core participants in this phase of the investigation. Keith said that the inquiry's job would be to ask whether or not anything could have been done to reduce the loss and suffering caused by the death and illness on an unprecedented scale. He described the widespread social damage and unmitigated health needs and the damage to educational prospects and financial insecurity and immense cost to human and financial terms. Lawyers for groups representing disabled people, ethnic minority groups, women, children, and frontline workers have urged the inquiry to investigate how far the government actually accounted for their needs. Liv Davis, the QC representing the organisation for Help the Victims of Domestic Abuse, said the inquiry also must investigate whether the government decisions were backed by the Equalities Impact Assessments. Phil Dale, who represents the Federation of Ethnic Minority and Healthcare Organisations, called for the institutional and structural racism to be considered. The inquiry is pressing ahead with a listening exercise to gather and summarize testimonials from people affected by the pandemic, despite opposition from bereavement groups who want their testimonies to be taken as evidence. The inquiry has issued at least a £970,000 contract to the polling firm Ipsos to carry out this exercise, and an £800,000 contract to the public communications company M&C Sharty to actually inform the public how to take part. The inquiry chair, Lady Hallett, has stressed that some personal testimonies would also be heard in evidence where they relate to systemic failings. The inquiry is wrestling with how to prevent the sprawl of an already huge exercise that will take several years. The Cabinet Office has also said that many potently relevant documents and material alone would also take at least 3 years to review. 39 groups of core participants representing at the parliamentary model, 2 hearings including at least 3 long COVID support groups, disabilities rights, children's groups and bereaved family groups representing the UK and Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. The health system was represented by NHS England, the British Medical Association and Social Care Operations, and government bodies ranging from the Department of Health and Social Care, the Office of England's Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, and the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments. So, as you can see, the COVID inquiry is heating up. And I think they know, I think the Conservatives fully know that this inquiry is going to start producing, I think, some absolute bangers. I really, really do. I think we're going to start seeing stuff from this inquiry on a regular basis, especially next summer, where we start to see witnesses questioned and cross-examined. So, do you really think that they wanted Boris Johnson in, who might be overly responsible for a lot of this bad decision making, in charge? I don't think so. So I think that's yet another reason why they didn't want Boris Johnson. But even then, this will fall directly on the Tory government's shoulders, because they were the ones in charge during the pandemic. They were the ones about the decision making. It's all on them and their mistakes, and the Tories know it. They've said for years, trying to put off this inquiry, that when it happens, they know they're in for an absolute kicking. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and of course, we'll see you all next time.